What would you do if the only thing standing between life and death for your children was a man the whole town feared? A man known for turning people away. A man who had shut his door to the world for 15 long years. Would you still knock? Would you still beg? That is exactly what one desperate mother did on a scorching Texas morning, and her courage changed a whole community forever. In the unforgiving heat of the Texas summer, where the sun baked the earth until it cracked like old leather, a mother staggered across the dusty plains with 2 fever-stricken babies pressed against her chest. Sarah Miller had been walking since dawn, the weight of her 6-month-old twins growing heavier with every mile. The harsh heat rose in shimmering waves, making the land look like it was melting. Her lips were cracked, her shawl torn, and her breath came in sharp, painful pulls. But she kept moving. She had to. Her babies were dying. Everyone in Promise, Texas whispered about Thornfield Ranch. Some said the owner, James Thornfield, had a heart as dry as the drought-stricken land he tended. Others said he was mean. Others claimed he simply didn't care anymore. Years ago, he'd shut himself away after the death of his wife, refusing visitors, refusing help, refusing connection. Folks said even the church ladies couldn't reach him. But people also whispered something else. They said he had once been an army medic, the kind of man who knew how to save a life when nobody else could. The kind of man who had held dying soldiers in his arms and brought them back from the edge. Sarah clung to that whisper like it was her last hope. Behind her, miles of dust marked her journey. Ahead of her stood the old wooden sign for Thornfield Ranch, its hand-carved letters fading from years of storms and sun. The ranch looked deserted, silent, almost unforgiving. But she kept going. Inside his ranch house, James Thornfield finished his black coffee and stepped onto the porch. The morning sun had barely risen, but the heat already pressed heavy on the land. His German shepherd, Doc, trotted beside him as he made his rounds. The drought had taken half his cattle, the well had dropped another inch, and the silence around him was the only company he chose to keep. He had built his life around the things that did not ask questions: fences, cattle, weather patterns, and the quiet wind. He didn't want visitors. He didn't want stories. And he didn't want memories. But that morning, Doc stopped suddenly, ears pointed forward. James lifted his binoculars and saw something across the shimmering heat. A shape, then another. At first he thought it was a stray horse, or maybe a lost cow. But as the figure grew clearer, his heart tightened. A woman. Stumbling. Carrying something. He lowered the binoculars fast, his jaw tightening. He didn't want trouble. He'd had enough trouble for a lifetime. But something in that woman's steps told him this wasn't ordinary trouble. This was desperation. Sarah's vision blurred as she neared the ranch gate. Her legs trembled. The babies felt hotter than the sun beating down on her back. Emma whimpered weakly. Ethan barely moved at all. Their little faces were red with fever, their tiny breaths shallow and uneven. "Just a little more," Sarah whispered, though her voice cracked from dryness. "Just stay with me." Her foot caught on a rock. She stumbled. The world spun. She forced herself upright again. 20 yards from the gate, she almost fell. 15 yards, and her knees buckled. 10 yards, and she saw a tall figure standing on the porch, watching her. A man with broad shoulders, a weathered hat, and a face carved by years of loss. James Thornfield. 5 yards, and Emma gave a soft, weak cry. Then the ground rushed up to meet her. James, boots hit the dirt before he even realized he'd moved. He reached her right as she collapsed, catching her before she struck the ground. Her skin burned with sun and fever. But the babies, he froze. They were burning up. He could feel the heat through the cloth, a kind of heat he recognized instantly, a kind that could steal a life fast. Sarah forced her eyes open. "Please," she whispered. "They're all I have." Her hand slipped from his shirt and left a perfect print in the dust. Something inside James cracked. A memory flashed. His wife Martha's last moments, her hand slipping from his helplessness as he watched the light fade from her eyes. The moment that had driven him to shut the world out. He swallowed hard. "I've got you," he said quietly, surprising even himself with the softness in his voice. Doc barked once, sensing the change. James lifted Sarah and the twins into his arms, their small bodies limp and scorching hot. "Doc," he called, voice steady and commanding like the soldier he once was. "Go, get the house ready." The dogs sprinted ahead. James carried mother and children through the gate, the hinges creaking like the start of a story long overdue. Behind him, dust rose on the horizon. A cloud of it. Vehicles. People. Trouble. Maybe, or maybe something else. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, 2 tiny lives lay in his arms. And he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't letting them die. The thermometer slipped from Doc Matthews, hand and shattered on the floor, but no one cared about the broken glass. All eyes were fixed on the small number he had read moments before. Emma's fever had climbed again. 104. 5. Too high. Too fast. The room fell silent. Only the crackling of the oil lamp and Emma's weak cries filled the air. Sarah covered her mouth with shaking hands, tears spilling down her cheeks. Ethan whimpered beside his sister, sensing her struggle. "Doc," James said, his voice low but steady, "tell me our options." Matthews closed his eyes for a moment. "We're out of time. The medicine needs longer to work. The ice is melting, if that fever climbs any higher." Sarah shook her head desperately. "No, no, she can't, please." James's jaw tightened. He'd seen this before, out in the field, in war zones where supplies ran dry and hope ran thin. But this wasn't a soldier. This was a baby. A little girl fighting for each breath. "We need a way to cool her fast," he said. Doc Matthews pulled off his glasses. "We can't put her in cold water. It would shock her heart." "Not cold water," James said slowly, "but colder than what we have." Quote. His mind raced, flipping through memories he had spent years trying to forget. Men freezing in the Korean winter. Field medics saving lives by controlling the shock, not avoiding it. Then the answer hit him like a thunderbolt. The spring. Matthews looked up sharply. "James, that water is freezing. And it might be the only thing that saves her." Sarah looked between them, her voice barely a whisper. "Do it. Whatever it takes, save my baby." James didn't hesitate again. He stripped off his shirt, grabbed blankets and fashioned a sling to hold Emma close to his chest. Her tiny body burned against him like a fire that refused to die out. Thunder, the stallion, was already saddled by the time he stepped outside. Pastor Roberts and Mrs. Henderson stood on the porch watching, fear and hope blending in their eyes. "You're sure?" Matthews asked one last time. "I'm sure," James said. "And she doesn't have another hour." He mounted Thunder with Emma secured tightly against him. The judge's horse followed, carrying Doc Matthews and his medical bag. Sarah stood on the porch clutching Ethan, her voice trembling but firm. "Bring her back to me," she whispered. James touched the brim of his hat. "A promise." Then, Thunder shot forward. The wind stung his face, the cold air hitting Emma's burning cheeks. Her cries weakened. James held her tighter, murmuring softly, "Stay with me, little one. Just a little longer." The spring lay hidden behind a rocky ridge. When James reached it, mist curled above the dark water, cold enough to numb a man's hand in seconds. He waded in without fear, the water rising to his waist, then to his chest. "Slow," Doc Matthews warned, "nice and slow." James lowered Emma inch by inch, feeling her small body tremble. Her skin reacted instantly, but he kept her close, held against his heartbeat. The shock hit him too, memories of frozen winters, battlefield triage, but he forced his breathing steady. "Come on, sweetheart," he whispered. "Fight." Minutes passed, longer than any he had ever lived. Matthews checked her temperature again, hands shaking. 103, 8, good, keep going, quote. James exhaled, his breath shaking. That's it. That's my girl. Another minute. 103, 2. Another. 102, 7. Her cries softened, her breathing evened. Then, for the first time since yesterday, her little muscles relaxed. James let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. She's stabilizing, Matthew said, wiping his eyes. James, she's coming back. When they returned to the ranch house, Sarah ran toward them, Ethan still in her arms. She collapsed to her knees when she saw Emma's cooler skin, her peaceful face. James placed the tiny girl back into her mother's trembling hands. She's not out of danger yet, he said softly, but she's fighting. Sarah looked up at James Thornfield as if he had hung the moon. By the next morning, the fever had dropped even more. Volunteers arrived with ice, blankets, clean water, and medicine. The whole town seemed to breathe again. Hours later, Judge Harrison's Buick rolled into the yard carrying more supplies. The church bell had rung the old emergency signal. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. The whole town answered. People arrived in trucks, on horseback, even on foot. They came because of 2 babies. They stayed because of 1 man. The man they thought had a heart like stone. Inside the house, the kitchen buzzed with activity. Ellen Miller brewed coffee. Mrs. Henderson warmed milk for the twins. Pastor Roberts prayed softly in the corner. And the living room looked more alive than it had in 15 years. James stood quietly by the window, watching his once lonely ranch fill with people working together. For the first time in a long time, something softened inside him. Maybe he had spent too many years alone. Maybe healing wasn't just for the sick. Maybe it was for him too. Then Doc Matthews called from the bedroom, excitement in his voice. "Temperature's holding steady. They're responding." Sarah burst into tears of relief. Emma stirred gently in her sleep. And James felt his chest loosen in a way he had forgotten was possible. Because sometimes the hardest hearts crack open exactly when they're needed most. Because sometimes a miracle doesn't fall from the sky. Sometimes it walks up to your gate and collapses at your feet. Morning light spilled through the open windows of Thornfield Ranch, warm and golden, touching everything like a blessing. For the first time since Sarah collapsed at the gate, the house felt calm, peaceful, alive. Emma and Ethan slept side by side on James's bed, their cheeks rosy, their breath soft and steady. Their fevers had finally broken during the night. Their skin was cool. Their tiny hands no longer trembled. The worst was over. Sarah sat in Martha's old rocking chair, the one volunteers had brought down from the attic. She held Emma in her arms while Ethan slept near her feet. She rocked gently, humming a lullaby her mother had taught her. Tears of relief slipped down her cheeks, but this time they weren't from fear. They were from gratitude, from hope, from the miracle she never expected. James stood quietly in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the scene. The morning sun caught the lines on his face, making him look older in some ways and younger in others. His ranch had not looked like this in years, full of people, full of movement, full of light. Doc the German shepherd lay near the twins, keeping careful watch, his tail thumping whenever one of them stirred. Ellen appeared beside James, wiping her hands on her apron. "Coffee's ready," she whispered. James nodded but didn't move. His eyes were fixed on Sarah and the twins, something in the way he watched them, careful, steady, almost protective, said more than any words. "You did a good thing, James," Ellen whispered. He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. Behind them, more volunteers arrived, bringing warm milk, fresh bread, blankets, even flowers from whatever gardens managed to survive the drought. The town of Promise, Texas, had decided that these twins were their twins, and that this ranch was now their ranch too. For days, people rotated shifts. Some watched the babies. Some cooked meals. Some fixed fences and mended broken things around the ranch. Others cleaned windows and swept floors, turning Thornfield Ranch into something it hadn't been in 15 long years. A home, not just for James, for everyone. By the end of the week, the twins were strong enough to sit up with help. Their small fists grabbed at anything they could reach. Their giggles filled the rooms like sunlight, and the town kept coming. One evening, with the sky painted pink and gold, Judge Harrison approached James on the porch holding a stack of papers. "You should see this," he said. James frowned. "What now?" "Requests," the judge said, tapping the papers. "People want to help. They're asking if you plan to open something here. A clinic, maybe. Or a place for families to get care. Folks say if someone like you is willing to step forward again," he paused, "they'll stand with you." James stared at him. A clinic. Here. On this land. Martha had wanted that once. He felt something shift inside him, softly, quietly, like a door opening. Pastor Roberts joined them on the porch. "You saved those babies, James. Not alone. No one's saying that. But you started something." His eyes softened. "And the town is ready to finish it with you." Sarah stepped out onto the porch then, holding Ethan in her arms. Emma clung sleepily to her shoulder. The babies were healthy now, stronger every day. Their faces glowed with life. She walked toward James slowly, tears shining in her eyes. "You didn't have to save them," she said softly, "but you did. You didn't have to open your home, but you did. I'll never be able to repay you." James cleared his throat, uncomfortable with praise. "You walked miles in the heat with 2 sick babies. You didn't quit. That kind of courage," he paused, "that kind of courage deserves help." Sarah smiled, small at first, then warm and full. "You gave me back my whole world," she whispered. "You gave this town hope again." The twins reached for him then, both tiny hands stretching out toward the man who saved their lives. James froze. Then, slowly, gently, he lifted them both into his arms. Emma giggled. Ethan tugged on his shirt. And something inside James Thornfield, something long buried under grief and silence, finally broke free. He held the twins close, their soft weight pressing against his chest, and felt a warmth he hadn't felt since Martha was alive. Sarah watched him with a look that said she understood more than words could say. Days turned into weeks, and Promise Texas changed. The hidden spring James used to cool Emma's fever turned out to be strong enough to help struggling farms. Volunteers built irrigation lines. Families stayed afloat. Fields turned green again. And Thornfield Ranch became something entirely new. A place of healing, a place of community, a place where hope lived. The town built a small clinic on James's land with Sarah as its first nurse. People came from miles away for help, for medicine, for comfort. And James, slowly, steadily, became the man he once was. One evening, under a sky full of stars, Sarah stood beside him on the porch rocking Emma, while Ethan slept against her shoulder. "You ever think," she whispered, "that maybe we all ended up right where we were meant to be?" Quote. James looked out at the land, the ranch, the clinic, the lights of neighbors working late. He saw families laughing. He saw water flowing again. He saw 2 healthy babies sleeping in Sarah's arms, and he felt it. Peace. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Maybe we did." Sarah leaned her head against his arm, her voice soft as the night breeze. "Sometimes the hardest seasons lead to the biggest miracles." James looked down at her, then at the twins, and for the first time in years, he believed it.